So in this video, I'm going to show you how to get off auto mode using the Sony ZV-E10. The prerequisite to this video would be the ZV-E10 beginner's guide. It's a really long video, totally catered for beginners. So if you've gone through that video and you're looking to get more power out of your camera, then this would be the next video for you to watch, because in this video, I'm going to go over aperture, shutter speed, manual mode, and bulb mode. Those are the more advanced exposure modes that will give you more power and control over your camera in order to manipulate things like motion blur, depth of field play, things like that that are a little bit more advanced. You might not know what that means, but in this video, I'm going to go over all that stuff using my lab scene as a demonstration so you can actually see exactly what I'm talking about when I'm doing it. So let's just get right into it. All right, so the first thing I want to cover is the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle is basically a visual illustration of how a camera works when it comes to aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So starting with aperture. Aperture is the lens pupil. And you can see here how the lens diaphragm or lens pupil is changing in size. That changing in size is known as f-stops. And if you think about it like water, the smaller the size that pupil hole is, the longer it's going to take for water to travel through it. And that's how you kind of have to think of aperture, because the aperture diaphragm, the smaller it is, the longer it's going to take for the light to travel through. Now, it's not that you're not changing light speed, it's just the size of the hole is smaller. So for the sensor to gather all that information, it's just going to take more time. It's not actually slowing the light down. Don't think that. So aperture also controls depth of field, and I will illustrate that concept in the lab scene if you don't understand what depth of field is. It is a little bit confusing, so that's why I want to visually show it to you rather than just ramble on and on. The next thing we're going to go over is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed, all you got to do is think about a clock, think about time. All shutter speed is time. It's how long the sensor is going to be exposed to light. Or the scene, let's say, right? So when the shutter opens, the sensor is exposed, it's gonna collect the data on the sensor, and then it's gonna close, and that's your image. So that amount of time that the shutter is open is shutter speed. And you could obviously manipulate shutter speed to freeze action. If you want to freeze a sports athlete running at full speed or swinging a bat, you're going to need a really fast shutter speed, and that means that the shutter is going to open up and close extremely quick, freezing the action. Now, if you want to capture motion blur, like blurry water, or you want people walking and you want them to look blurry, whatever the case may be, a car, streaky taillights, those cool taillight looks that you see, those photos with the streaky lights and stuff like that, you would want a much slower shutter speed. And that would leave the shutter open longer, so the stuff going past becomes blurry, and then the shutter closes, and that gives you motion blur. So you can control that with shutter speed, freezing the action and motion blur. Now, the last thing on the bottom of the exposure triangle here is ISO. Now, the ISO is the sensor sensitivity. So how I like to think about that is kind of like voltage or a stereo when there's no music playing. When you just keep cranking that volume up, you start to hear that noise, like that hissing or whatever you might get. And that's because it's just you're overdriving the system. And ISO is basically the sensor sensitivity. And the higher that number, the more noise that you're going to introduce to the images. And lastly is bulb mode, but I will cover that in the lab when I show you live. So let's get into the lab and I'll show you exactly how all this stuff works. All right, guys, so as you can see, I got the little lab scene set up for you. First thing we're going to do is if you hit the function button, the FN button right here, let's hit that. And we're going to go all the way to the right and go down, and that's where the camera modes are, or shoot mode as it says there. So we're going to change that to aperture priority mode, which you can see right here, aperture priority. And that's what we're going to demonstrate first in this lab scene. So aperture, as I said earlier, is the size of the lens diaphragm and how open or closed it is. All right, so here we go. So we're in aperture priority mode. So aperture priority mode. Now down here, see the F right there? That is the aperture number, and that stands for an f-stop. So this lens right now is at f5.6. Now, if I turn this dial, notice how the aperture changes. So f3.5 is the lowest aperture that this lens offers. But the lower the number, the larger the aperture. So it's actually the opposite of what you might think if you're new to this. So as I stop down the aperture, and the process of stopping down is when I'm raising the aperture number here. So I'm stopping the lens down, and I just keep going, f8, f9, it'll go all the way up to as far as it goes. Now some lenses only go to f16, other lenses go all the way to f32. It really depends on the type of lens and what kind of camera you're using and so forth. So that's what Aperture does. It changes the f-stops, which directly marries up to the size of the aperture diaphragm opening. Okay, so also notice when I turn the aperture diaphragm, watch the shutter speed change. Also note, I have the ISO set to 100, so it's set hard at 100. If yours is set to auto there, you're going to want to change that. So just hit the right side of this rear dial, and that will bring you into the ISO menu, and just scroll down until you get to 100, and set it at 100 for now for this demonstration. So I just want you guys to follow along exactly how I'm set up so you don't have any issues. Okay, so now that the ISO is set to 100, just make sure it's set there. When you stop the lens down, notice how I'm closing the aperture diaphragm, right? So I'm making that diaphragm smaller, so it's going to take more time for the light to travel into the sensor. And that's why the shutter speed is getting longer and longer and longer. So 1/8 of a second it's going to take, 1/6 of a second, 1/5 of a second, all the way up to half a second. Now we're up to 1.3 seconds for a proper exposure. So if I take this image, it's going to have to sit there for 1.3 seconds to get the proper exposure. So if there's anything moving in the scene, it's going to be blurry. Watch. If I hit the playback menu, you see how on the top left that little wind thing is blurry? Because the shutter speed was so long. And that's because I had the lens stop down to f22. All right, so let me show you how Aperture affects depth of field next. So if I zoom in here, and I focus on the face, you see how the background is all blurry? And also note the tape measure. If you look at the tape measure, you can see how the tape measure numbers are sharp, like right here. If I hit the tracking, if I touch to track, you could see the tape measure. Let me just zoom in here so you can see it. See the tape measure right there? Let me zoom out just a touch. You see how it's getting sharp at the 16 and then it just gets blurrier and blurrier? That's what depth of field is. So depth of field is the sliver of sharpness, the sliver of acceptable sharpness. And right now the lens is a variable zoom lens. So when I zoomed in, I'm at f5.6. When I zoom out, it goes to f3.5. See that? Because it's a variable aperture lens. Now in this case, I'm at 50 millimeter. So with the kit lens at 50 millimeter, the fastest aperture I have is f5.6. So I can't open the aperture anymore. It doesn't go any further, see? But watch what happens when I stop it down. So if I put it at like f16, and then I focus on this tape measure again, take a picture. Now let me show you what it looks like, and you will see how the depth of field changed. So now you see how there's a lot of numbers that are sharp? That's because the depth of field got larger. So it stretched out, it like gained distance. And that's why when you take a landscape photo, you might want everything sharp from the front of the scene to the back of the scene. And that's why you always hear people will recommend stopping the lens down. So because I'm so close to my subject right now, my subjects, let's say, this is an exaggerated effect. But in the real world, normally in a landscape, you know, the foreground starts 5 feet away, 6, 7, 8 feet away, and then it might go all the way to the mountains in the distance. So it won't be as exaggerated as this, but the lab scene is great for exploiting this because it really illustrates how depth of field works and how it correlates to aperture. Let me just show you this. I'm at f5.6 at 1/13 of a second. The only way to make that shutter speed faster is to change the ISO to a higher number. If I change the ISO to auto, watch what happens. It automatically puts the shutter at 1/80th of a second. You see that? And if I press the shutter down, you can see the ISO is at 640 now. So it raised up the ISO to get a faster shutter speed of 1/80th of a second at f5.6. Now if I stop it down more to like f9, watch what happens to the ISO now. Now it's at ISO 1600. So the ISO keeps going up to compensate for the aperture because it wants to maintain that shutter speed. And remember, I'm using auto ISO, that's why it's maintaining that shutter speed. If I change it off auto and put it back to a hard fixed number, my shutter speed is going to get a lot slower. See there? Now it's at 1/5 of a second. Now, let me just show you what it looks like with a faster lens. All right, so now I have the Sigma 30mm f1.4 lens mounted, but I'm still at f9 because that's how the camera was set. So let me stop it down and just watch how the background gets blurrier and blurrier and blurrier as I stop it down. Now I'm at f1.4. And you can see just how blurry the background is and how narrow that depth of field is. There we go, right about there. Let me take a picture and show you what that looks like. Watch this. So remember, this is a much larger max aperture. f1.4 is way faster than f3.5, which is what the kit lens is at. Look at that. See how narrow the depth of field is? So now the depth of field is like 1/4 of an inch. It's like almost nothing. And that's because I'm using a much faster lens, a wider max aperture lens of f1.4. Also notice I'm at ISO 100 and I have a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second now. Remember with the other lens, the shutter speed was way slower. It was at like 1/13th of a second or something like that. So that's another advantage of having fast lenses. This is why wedding photographers, portrait photographers, anybody shooting in low light always wants a faster lens, because that faster lens is going to allow you to get a faster shutter speed at a lower ISO number. And if you refer to the exposure triangle like I was talking about earlier, you can see how the relationships marry up. The faster the aperture, the faster the shutter speed is going to be at a lower ISO value. Now, of course, I could always raise the ISO up. If I need a super fast shutter speed, I can raise it up to like ISO 400, and now I have a shutter speed of 1/800th of a second. So if I was in a gymnasium and I'm trying to freeze action, you would need a shutter speed of like 1/800th of a second, possibly even faster than that. So that's how you would go about doing that using aperture priority mode. You can just jack up that ISO even more, which will raise the shutter speed even faster. And the faster the lens is, the lower the ISO needs to be. And that's pretty much how aperture works. I hope that makes sense. And let me just take another shot of the model's face so you can see the difference. And then I'll stop it down and I'll take another image so you can see how the background becomes much more clear when it's stopped down to f16. So here's f1.4 versus f16. So you can really see that depth of field difference. And also, one more time, I just want to notice the shutter speed. It's at 1/8 of a second when I stop down to f16. And f16 is as high as this lens goes. So if I lower that all the way to f1.4, now I'm at 1/800th of a second because I'm at ISO 400. Change that ISO back to 100. And now we are at 1/200th of a second. So that's how it works. All right, so let's move on to shutter speed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the function menu, and I'm going to go over to the right here, and I am going to go to shutter speed. Now remember, shutter speed equals time. The shutter basically opens up and then closes to allow light to come in to the camera sensor. Right now the shutter is actually open because we're using the sensor to see what we're doing. But when you take a photo, the shutter actually goes boom, boom. It like closes and opens again. And the length of time that it closes and opens is the shutter speed. So right now it's set to 1/250th of a second. And the aperture is at f1.4. So if I turn the dial, now you can turn the top dial or you can turn the dial here on the back. It doesn't matter which one you use when you're in aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode. So if I slow the shutter speed down, notice how the aperture is going up. Similar to how the shutter speed was changing, and now the aperture is blinking because there is no more. The aperture can't go any higher than f16. So 1/2 of a second is the slowest shutter speed I can get with this given lens installed. I could use an ND filter, which is tinted glass. I could put tinted glass in front of the lens. They make ND filters that screw right onto the front of lenses. And that tinted glass will then make it so I can get a much slower shutter speed with this lens, because you could only go to f16. So that tinted glass would be a way around that. And that's why I always recommend getting a variable ND filter with your lens. Let me just put the kit lens back on here. Okay, so now I have the kit lens on there, and it's obviously a much slower lens. The max aperture is f3.5, and the shutter speed is 1/30th of a second in this scenario. So let me just spin this guy here, and I'll take a photo. Go to playback, And you can see there's a little bit of motion there. You can see it's not that sharp, it's a little bit blurry, and that's because it's at 1/30th of a second. So if you have a subject moving in front of you, that's even if it's not moving fast, it's going to be a little bit blurry. So in order to freeze the action, you're going to need to raise up that shutter speed. All right, so I want to get this at 1/400th of a second, and I want that to stop blinking. And that's blinking right now because the exposure is off. It's underexposed, so I need to raise the ISO higher. Let me put it at 1600, and there we go. That's a proper exposure. So it changed it to f4.5 to make sure the exposure is correct. I could raise the shutter a little bit more. All right, 1/500th of a second. So now we're at 1/500th of a second. This is great for sports, but unfortunately, because the lens is a slower lens, I have to have the ISO all the way at 1600, which is going to introduce some noise. Let me spin this guy. Now that should have easily froze that. And yeah, as you can see, it's frozen. So let me spin it a little faster. It should still freeze it at 1/500th of a second. And yeah, look, it's frozen solid. So that's how you capture action. Now watch what happens when I slow the shutter speed down. Let's put it at like 1 full second. All right, there's 1 full second. Now it's way overexposed because I have the ISO set to 1600. Let's put that ISO back to 100. Like so. There we go. So now it changed the lens to f20 to get a super long 1 second exposure. Remember, the Sigma lens went to f16, and the slowest shutter I was able to get with that lens was half a second. So this one I'm able to get a full second more because it has a smaller aperture or a higher aperture number. So watch what happens when I take this image. You see how blurry that sucker is? It's pretty cool, right? Let's move on to manual mode. Manual mode is my favorite mode, and it's the most powerful because it gives you the ability to control everything independently. So let me click on manual mode here. And remember, I just went into the function menu to do that. And now what you're looking at is a super overexposed scene. And that's because you could see right here, there's a meter. And the meter on the camera only works in manual mode. Right now it's telling you it's at +2. It's actually higher than +2, that's why it's blinking. So what I need to do is I need to either raise the shutter speed or stop down the lens. I can do it either way. So watch, I can stop the lens down, and there we go, now we're at 0. So now I have a proper exposure. But watch, I can put that back where it was, and I can change the shutter speed. I can make the shutter speed faster, so this way there's less time for the light to come in, and that will also fix the exposure. Watch. See? So you can manipulate the exposure using shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So now watch when I raise the aperture. I'm going to raise it up to like f8. So now the image is underexposed by 2 full stops. So I can fix this by either changing the ISO, by raising it up, or by slowing down the shutter speed. Watch this. See the meter? There you go, perfect exposure. So 1/8 of a second at f8 using ISO 100. Now, the problem is I might need a faster shutter speed. I might want to use f8 and I'm hand holding, so there's no way I can have a 1/8 of a second shutter speed if I'm hand holding at f8. So what I need to do is I need to raise that ISO. Let me raise that ISO up to like 400. Now I can raise that shutter speed. So this way I won't get a blurry image if I'm trying to hand hold. So I'm only at 1/25th of a second now. That's still pretty darn slow. Let me put it at 800, and now I should be able to get that shutter. There we go. Now we're at 1/60th of a second. So now you can hand hold 1/60th of a second, get a nice sharp shot. f8 is a really good aperture for getting a lot of the scene in focus. So landscapes and stuff like that, most of the time these days I use about f8 to f11 for landscapes. And if I'm hand holding, I would have to raise the ISO up a little bit to make sure that I have a decent enough shutter speed to ensure that the image is not blurry from like handshake and stuff. So that's what's so cool about manual mode, is you can manipulate everything independently. Another cool thing is you can use a manual mode with auto ISO, but then the meter doesn't work. So now the meter just stays at 0 because it's always adjusting for you. So when I turn the shutter speed or whatever, it's automatically adjusting the ISO and the exposure is staying correct. See, it's at ISO 160 because it's on auto. And if I turn this again, but notice how the image isn't getting dark like it was before. Like right now, the image should be dark, but because it's auto ISO, it's not getting dark. So let's see what happens. Now it's starting to get dark because I ran out of ISO. The auto ISO only goes so far. So if I hit the shutter, the ISO is going to be at its maximum that I have it set to. So right now the ISO is set to a maximum of 12,800 and that's where it's at. So to get a proper exposure, I'm going to need to turn this back until the ISO stops blinking. Right there. It looks like f8 at 1/800th of a second is the best I can do as far as fast shutter speeds go with this camera set currently as it is. And that's at ISO 12,800. So check this out. If you hit the ISO button, and I'm in auto ISO, if you hit this arrow, you can go to the right. Look at this. And now you have your ISO auto maximum. I can raise that up to even higher numbers. Look at this. So that's the maximum ISO, 51,200. So now watch this. Now I can raise the shutter speed up. So I can go all the way to 1/3200th of a second. That is definitely going to freeze any kind of action. Look at what it's doing. It's putting the ISO at the maximum, 51,200. So this is going to look like garbage. I'll show you that shot full size as well. Obviously, you want the ISO as low as possible. So again, this is the advantage of using a faster lens in a lot of cases. But if you need that aperture at f8 and you just need a super fast shutter speed, then what you're going to want to do is bring in auxiliary lighting to light the scene if possible. Worst case scenario, use that high ISO if you have to, but it's definitely not recommended to use an ISO that high because it just doesn't look good. So if I put this back to ISO 100, that's the ideal ISO, and now you can see it's completely underexposed. See the metering mode is there showing you again? So let me lower that shutter speed, and you can see the image starting to come back like so. And there you have it. So ISO 100 at f8, 1/6 of a second is a proper exposure in this particular scene. And that is how manual mode works. So let me just do a little use case here. I want the lens at the maximum aperture, which in this case is f3.5. And now you can see my image is overexposed. So what are my options here? Just think about it for a second. What are my options? I'm already at ISO 100, so I can't lower that. Technically, I can lower it because I'm in photo mode. So I could lower it to 50 like that. But you can't record video in these lower ISO numbers. So you can lower it to 50. But now look, it's still overexposed. Now what am I going to do? The shutter speed. I have to raise the shutter speed. I have to make it faster. I have to lessen the amount of time. If I lessen the amount of time, that's going to fix the meter. See, the meter's now at 0. And now if I want a faster shutter speed, like say I need 1/60th of a second. Now look, what are my options? I can't open the aperture anymore, so my only option is to raise the ISO. So if I raise that ISO, I can just put it on auto if I want, or I can raise it to like 400, whatever I think is good. It looks like 200 will work. Yeah, 200's perfect. Look, the meter's at 0. Now let me show you how bulb mode works. So bulb mode, you have to be in manual mode to use bulb mode. What you do is you lower the shutter speed and you just keep going. Eventually it gets to 30 seconds and then it'll go into bulb. Now I'm in bulb mode. So bulb mode is beyond 30 seconds. And what bulb mode does, it allows you to press the shutter and hold it for as long as you want, and then you just let go yourself when you're done. Now this would obviously be much better if you were using a remote control, because you really don't want to be touching the camera. You have to hold the shutter button down when you do this. So a remote is highly preferable. A remote like this will work, and I highly recommend using a remote because otherwise it's going to introduce a little bit of camera shake and your image will be blurry if you have those long exposures. Now what's cool about bulb mode though is you can go longer than 30 seconds. You can go like 2 minutes. Like if it's pitch black out, you can do a 2-minute exposure and get these super dreamy shots where like the water will look like smoke. Amazing types of shots you can get using bulb mode. And that's how you do that. You just turn the shutter speed past 30 in manual mode. And remember, you can change the aperture with the top dial using manual mode and shutter speed with the bottom dial, like so. And that's how that works. All right, so if I switch the camera into video mode now, you can also change what mode you're in when using video mode. So if I hit the function menu, notice how it's on program auto. If you go in there, you can change to aperture priority mode. See that? So now I'm in aperture priority mode in video. So you can use these modes in either photography or video, and it works exactly the same. It affects depth of field and so forth. So if I'm zoomed in on this little model's face there, like so, and I'm recording video, I can just click over here on this side of the scene, and it'll switch the focus from one spot to another. All right, so if I hit record, check out this depth of field shift. See that? So I'm switching the depth of field plane. Remember how I was explaining that before with the tape measure? So the depth of field plane is switching to the back of the scene, and now you can see the face is nice and blurry because it's no longer in the depth of field plane. And if I switch it back to the face, now the background is blurry and the rest of the tape measure is blurry because of the depth of field plane. And so that's how you would use aperture and also focus switching in order to get these cool depth of field throws, and it's a really popular thing to do with video. And again, the faster the aperture, the more depth of field change you're going to have. As an example, let me just switch to the Sigma lens again, and I will show you what I mean. All right, this time I'm going to put the 56mm on there. So the 56mm will give the most depth of field play. Watch this. All right, so now the camera is focused on the face. So if I hit record, now watch what happens when I tap right there. It's going to switch to the dinosaur. There we go. All right, so it switched to the dinosaur, and now you can see the face is like out of focus. Now watch this. I can actually change the aperture while recording. And now the depth of field is crazy thin. You can see the face just looks like a blob at this point. And watch when I click on the face now. It switches back to the face, and look at that background. It just butters out. It just butters out. Looks so 3D. Pretty sweet, right? So again, that's how you can use aperture, depth of field, and stuff like that to manipulate your scene and also get that really cool blurry background, which results in super 3D looking images and video for that matter. I'm gonna just cancel tracking by hitting that center button. All right, guys, that about wraps up this video. I really hope you got what you were looking for when it comes to the more advanced camera modes. I tend to use aperture priority mode a lot of times when I'm taking portrait photos and also when I'm taking landscape photos. For portraits, for example, I would open up that aperture all the way wide open. If I was using one of those Sigma lenses, I would have it at f1.4, 1.8, something like that, and that'll give you nice blurry backgrounds. For landscapes, I would stop that aperture down to like f8, f11, and that'll give you more depth of field, which will give you a sharper shot from the front to the back of the scene. If I was trying to get motion blur, I would slow that shutter speed down, but you really want to use a tripod for that because you're going to introduce camera shake, and that will allow the camera to capture all the sharp stuff that's not moving, and then anything that is moving will become blurry. The best example of this, in my opinion, is flowing water. You could really see it so clearly when you're looking at flowing water, or stuff that's spinning. Anything that's spinning will illustrate it, as you can see in these sample photos I'm showing you. So the slower shutter speed and so forth. When it comes to recording in the studio, like I'm doing right now, I always use manual mode. So I will manually set the camera. Right now, my camera is set at f1.8. It's at 1/60th of a second, ISO 100, and the meter is telling me it's underexposed by 1/3 of a stop, which is how I want it, because I want to make sure my skin tones aren't blowing out right here. So I always just slightly underexpose it. That's just the way I like to do it. You don't have to, but it's much easier to raise up the exposure in post-processing than lower it when you blow out the highlights. So that's how I have my camera set. And I also have the white balance set to 5000 because that's what my light is configured to. And I have a large light up here, which is providing the light source. And I have another light over here, which is lighting up this side. So manual mode gives you full control. And I'm using the FE 35mm f1.8 lens on my Sony A7C. And manual mode is just a way better way to go. I have the ISO set to 100, so nothing will change. If I hold something up in front of the camera like that's really dark, like this, notice how the exposure is not changing. If I had the ISO set to auto, the scene would have completely changed. It would have got really bright because it would have tried to expose for this black camera. instead of the scene. But because I have that locked down, the exposure is not going to change no matter what I do in the scene. And that's why I always have it hard set in manual mode with a locked down ISO 100. Again, if you put that on auto ISO, your exposure might shift depending on what you're doing in your scene. And you don't want that. It doesn't look professional. Sometimes you do want the exposure to shift. It depends on what you're doing. But in a studio environment in general, you do not. So that's why I hard set everything as I just said. All right, so if you guys have any questions, be sure to ask below in the comments area. And also below the video in the description area, you will find links to recommended accessories for the Sony ZV-E10 and also all the camera gear that I use to record my videos if you want to check that out, if you're wondering what I'm using and stuff. And again, you know, be sure to ask if you have any questions. All right, so if you got what you were looking for in this video, please do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. And also consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this as time goes on. I just keep making videos every month, and more good stuff like this keeps coming out. So be sure to subscribe. All right, I will catch up with you guys next time. Please have a great day and take care, all right?